Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a spectacularly spooky Christmas Eve, waiting for Santa to plop down the chimney and stack pleasantly wrapped gifts under your tree while horfing down a plate of delectable cookies, all the while rubbing his big round belly. Don't wake up and creep into the living room, though, because if you see Santa, I've heard that Santa's visage is like that of a biblically accurate angel, and your eyes might just melt right out of your head. But, having said that, there are a few other creatures of the night that prowl around in the Yuletide season that you need to worry about. Everyone knows Krampus, as he's become like Santa, a relatively well-known pop culture figure. Though unlike Santa taking presents out of his bag and placing them under the tree, Krampus will take your kids and stick them in a basket on his back, then cane them and maybe even eat them. What he does varies on who's telling the story, but almost all of them agree he looks like a fucked up goat demon type of guy. Krampus is like Santa, but scarier. And also like Santa, Krampus has become kind of a pop culture product. Getting his own holiday movie, being used on merchandise, the works. I can't wait until Coca-Cola features Krampus in a holiday ad. Maybe hanging out with those cute little polar bears of theirs. But today isn't about Santa or Krampus. Santa is as well known as Jesus, and Krampus is too popular in our current pop culture of horror Christmas figures. Everyone's going to be talking about Krampus if they're going to talk about some type of evil Christmas thing. He's like the Kim Kardashian of evil Christmas monsters. No, today we're talking about a relatively unknown Christmas creep, known as Hans Trapp, the haunted Christmas Scarecrow, or the haunted Black Knight of Christmas. Never heard of him before? Well, I hadn't either until recently. Hans Trapp is a tale that hails from France and specific regions of Germany around the Alsace region. According to the tales, Trapp was a rich and powerful man who lived in the 1400s in France or Germany. In the region that he lived, he became known as a robber baron, willing to do anything to gain more power and influence in his life. This lust for power went so far that it extended from the corporeal realm of us mortals, leading Trapp to make a deal with a demon or even the devil himself. As word got out of his entanglement with the dark forces of our world, the Pope banished his ass. Trapp, now without his wealth or power, would wander into the mountains of Bavaria and take up refuge there. In some stories, he'd live in a cave, and in others, a creepy-ass shack. Trapp would there fester, his hatred for humanity growing in a sort of reverse Grinch situation. Instead of his heart growing 3 sizes too big, it grew smaller and more filled with anger and hate. Having already brought the dark ways of demons into his life and soul, the hatred within him twisted and transformed him into a terrifying monstrosity, and he slowly began to grow a hunger for human flesh. The story then goes that he happened upon a young shepherd's son while wandering through the mountains one day, and he stabbed him to death with a particularly sharp stick. He then dragged the body of the lifeless boy up into his mountain home, and prepared to chop him up and cook him to eat him, only for God to suddenly intervene at this point in the story and strike him with a divine bolt of lightning that killed him instantly. This isn't where the story ends, though. Apparently, being struck by a bolt of divine lightning sent by God himself wasn't enough, and it possibly even gave his ghost superpowers based on what happens next, as after being killed by God, his spirit began to haunt the lands where he'd once lived and roamed, finding scarecrows to possess and hunt down children who were being little turds at the holidays and eat them. And in some versions of the stories, he's also represented as a ghostly black knight, engulfed in shadows with bright red eyes, who I'm pretty sure does the same thing as the scarecrow, which is hunt down children, because most holiday monsters, that's what they do. Santa gives you a present, and if you're bad, you get killed by a knight for some reason. Spooky stuff, huh? Krampus is pretty scary, but as a kid, I was always far more scared of things like scarecrows and dolls instead of goat demons. I guess it's because I felt like it was far more likely to run into a scarecrow on the street than, like a scary goat demon. But really, either one is like being scared of quicksand as a kid. You're probably not going to run into either. But here's the real twist of this story. Hans Trapp was a real person. Was the story completely true? Did he really become a twisted demon based on his greed, who was then struck by a divine bolt of lightning, sent down by the Holy Ghost itself? Well, no, obviously not. Some of the story is true, but it's like 20% of it. 80% of the story is just made up because people didn't like this guy. Hans Trapp was a real person, but his actual name was Hans von Trotha, and he was a rich guy, and yes, he was kind of a piece of shit. Hans von Trotha was born to a wealthy family in Germany in the 1480s, and served under the local elector of the Palatine. The region in which he lived was also near the French region of Alsace, which is why the story spread there. And to explain, the electors of the Palatine were basically a series of princes underneath a section of the Holy Roman Empire, so Hans von Trotha was basically under a local prince. The elector that he was born under would eventually gift von Trotha a large swath of land and a few castles that turned out weren't really the elector's to give away. This started a nearly lifelong feud with a local abbot in the town of Weissenberg who actually had a legitimate claim to the land. This feud would eventually lead von Trotha to damming up a river upstream of the town of Weissenberg where the abbot was that supplied the town its fresh water. This, of course, created a small reservoir and limited the town of Weissenberg's supply of fresh water greatly. When the town and the abbot complained, von Trotha had the dam destroyed, which in turn caused the built-up water in the reservoir to flood the town downstream, definitely harming their economy and crops, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it led to the deaths of a few people as well, whether directly through drowning or, from bad crops and the economy going bad. Of course, history wouldn't remember the peasants that died, even if they did, because they were probably too poor to be remembered. This would eventually lead to von Trotha openly warring against the abbot, and this in turn would lead to him being summoned by a papal court by the Pope, which he ignored and then wrote a letter to the Pope accusing him of vague things like being immoral. This would seemingly lead to his excommunication from the church nearly 8 years after the beginning of the seemingly violent feud with the abbot. Wow, the hammer of justice sure moves quickly, doesn't it? Even after his horrible feud with the abbot and his excommunication from the church, he still led a very successful life, already being wealthy and even going on to serve on the French royal court, because of course powerful people never face consequences. And even after his death, he was relieved of all charges placed against him by the church posthumously. I mean, honestly, that's the real horror in this story, isn't it? That the rich and powerful never face consequences even in death. I mean, I guess being represented as an evil scarecrow ghost that eats children and was killed by God is a pretty big stain on his legacy, because barely anyone knows of the actual guy Hans von Trotha, and most people know of him as Hans Trapp, the evil creature that eats people at Christmas. I think this story is really cool because it's like Krampus. It's a Yuletide horror tale, and we don't have many of those. But also there's this twist that it is based on a real person who was kind of a piece of trash. Poor people around the Alsace region, and even the region of Germany where he hailed, crafted this tale around this guy because he was a rich kind of asshole, and made it to where he was a robber baron who became a monster from his own greed and dealing with darkness. And when you look this guy up, that's what you find is that story, first and foremost. If you went back in time to the people living in the time that he was alive, I think if you told them that, they'd go, huh, it's just what he deserves, but they wouldn't be too happy about it because he wasn't getting any actual justice when he was alive, for like flooding a town and feuding with a religious organization and starving a town of fresh water and all that kind of thing. The type of thing that, people back then would have really loved if he'd actually faced some consequences for, because that actually affected their lives, and like him, they're all dead now. I imagine a few hundred years from now, though, this is one of the reasons I think this is so interesting, is that there will be tales of horrible people from our time that people will spread around. I mean, they'll have more of a direct history connection, but if anything, it's been proven that most people don't care about history and will forget, and then the tales will persist more than anything. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed looking into this spooky scarecrow with me on the eve of Christmas. I hope you have a happy holiday, a pleasant Yuletide and winter season, and I'm very grateful to everyone who's decided to tune into my channel this year. I really do appreciate it. It's been a great year for me. I'm Ghosts on Holiday, and remember, have a Merry Christmas.